The pen hit the mahogany and spun toward the edge like it wanted to escape him. When it fell, the metallic click sounded final, like a latch on a vault door sealing shut. 30 people watched Daniel Nomelson, Tucson's favorite mogul, my rich, spotless husband, stare at nothing, lips parted, pupils blown like a man who'd just seen the shape of his ending. I didn't move to help. I folded my hands and let the silence work. Beyond the glass wall, the Sonoran sky burned clean and brutal, the Catalinas cut against it like a promise. Inside, the air conditioning hummed over cologne, fear, and the faint citrus polish on the long table where he'd humiliated people for sport. Not tonight. You're bluffing, he tried, voice a thread. I smiled the way surgeons smile before the first incision. Daniel, you built an empire on reading the room. Read this one. He could. The CFO wouldn't meet his eyes. Legal was stone. His PR chief was already calculating headlines, triaging donors, imagining a press release that wouldn't exist. At the far end, under the chandelier that threw little rings of light across her shiny hair, sat the sorority girl. Posture too proud, perfume too sweet, the kind of smile that cracks at the edges the moment it meets resistance. Poor child. She thought she was attending a private reconciliation. She was attending a live autopsy. This is inappropriate, Daniel said, throat dry. This is a board meeting. It's a reckoning, I said, and it's right on time. I placed the stack in front of him, tabs in desert colors, notes in a clean hand, highlights no one could argue with. The top sheet wasn't a receipt or a photo or the itemized ledger of his generosity toward a girl whose student housing somehow included a rented pied-à-terre above a cocktail bar. No, the top sheet was older than she was. Do you recognize Exhibit A? I asked. His eyes stuck to the heading as if it were a bright light. Premarital agreement. Nomelson, Hartley. My maiden name in print. His signature flowing like a signature always does when the signer thinks it's for show. You made me sign this 20 years ago, I said, schoolteacher calm. To protect the family brand. He hardened his mouth and tried leaning back into his myth. Standard. Everyone signs. Everyone, I agreed softly. Doesn't include Clause 14. A murmur moved the length of the table. He didn't look up. His gaze clung to the line I'd boxed in clean ink, the one he insisted on after a partner scandal rocked one of his friends and scorched a reputation that never grew back. Protect the brand, Daniel loved to say. Punish recklessness. Prove we are men of principle. He wrote it. I memorized it. Brooke, he started, finding a tone he only used for me. The room might as well have evaporated. Don't do this here. Here, I said, tapping the clause with one manicured nail, is exactly where this belongs. Through the glass, a monsoon shelf had begun to push up behind the mountains, a bruised purple seam under the white heat. The Sonoran can turn on you in a breath. So can a wife you underestimated. Let's save time, I said. I'm not here to scream. I'm not here to cry. I'm not here to ask why a 45-year-old man with a board seat and a legacy on the wall thought it wise to take a 20-something to a charity gala and call her by a nickname that doesn't belong in public spaces. I'm here to confirm a breach and enforce a remedy. Her smile flickered. She glanced at her phone like it could throw her a rope. It didn't. I nodded to our AV tech. Mine, not his. The screen at the end of the room woke to a still image. A narrow hallway, a pair of hands, a watch I'd given Daniel on our 10th anniversary. The Sonoran Children's Foundation Gala, the one with the cactus ice sculptures and the donor wall he loved to pose in front of. The hallway behind the main ballroom. His laugh in the audio, soft and careless. Her voice saying, "We shouldn't," in the exact tone girls use when they absolutely mean to. "Don't," he said, not to me but to the room, as if leadership were a spell he could still cast. "This is private." "You made it public," I said. "You just didn't know I'd booked the room." Another still. A receipt with our corporate card and a date that coincided with a trip he'd insisted was to Phoenix for a zoning presentation. Another. A Venmo screen capture for an amount that matched a semester's tuition. The notes full of emojis and Greek letters a man his age should never type. Every image was a rung in a ladder he'd built with his own hands. We were simply climbing it to the roofline. He reached for the stack as if he could swallow the paper and erase the evidence with his throat. I put a palm on it, stopping him the way you stop a child from touching a stove. The proof is courtesy, I said. Clause 14 doesn't require it. I watched the moment he actually remembered his own language. It hit him like a body check. The sorority girl, hearing only her pulse, whispered, "What's clause 14? I turned to her, kind as a hospice nurse. "It's the difference between an affair and a forfeiture." The quiet that followed had teeth. It bit. It drew blood. He tried for anger. His old tool. "You wanted this lifestyle. You liked the cars, the galas, "I liked my husband," I said. "You killed him. I'm attending the reading." Slight laughter somewhere. Strangled fast. Legal pretended to shuffle, as if papers suddenly required relocation. The portrait of Daniel's father, hung too high, watchful and smug, picked up a slice of chandelier light and stared down on a son who had learned all the wrong lessons perfectly. "You can't take me for everything," he said. But there was an entire boy inside his voice now. "It isn't possible." "Daniel," I said gently, "you wrote the mechanism. I'm just the finger on the key." I slid a second stack out from beneath the first. Notices drafted, clock started, the tight choreography of a clause designed to act fast when reputations are at stake. Trust triggers, voting proxies, escrows that open like trapdoors. He'd called it belt and suspenders when he first crowed about it 2 decades ago. Belt, suspenders, and a drop to the concrete, as it turns out. Once the wrong person unhooks it. "You insisted the brand survive any individual's moral collapse," I reminded him. "You built in an automatic transfer of authority to the spouse uninvolved in the breach, contingent upon proof that the breach occurred while representing the brand. Gala, donor wall, corporate card, your watch, your mouth, your hands. You were representing. You were wrecking." His skin went the color of undercooked dough. From the far seat, the PR chief finally spoke, voice small. "We should consider a closed session." "We're well past consider," I said. "We're in document." The sorority girl's bravado was a candle in wind. "You planned this," she said, accusation like it would sting. "Of course I planned this," I said. "You don't walk into a desert storm in silk." My phone vibrated once, on schedule. I didn't check it. I didn't have to. When you've laid ground glass across a threshold, you don't need to look to know when someone crosses. "Before we proceed," I said, and my voice leveled into something that made 3 people straighten their spines by reflex. "I want the record to be clean. No one here is confused. We are enforcing a contract Daniel authored and compelled me to sign, citing ethics and optics. The trigger has been satisfied. Remedy is automatic." "Automatic," Daniel echoed faintly, as if the shape of the word could change its meaning. I let him have 1 more minute of imagining he had oxygen. Then I set a single page atop the stack, its top third yellow where I'd highlighted the line he used to recite at dinner parties when he liked being impressive. "Read it," I said. Out loud. He didn't touch it. He stared at it like it might detonate in his hands. "Mr. Nomelson," legal said, voice clinical. "For the minutes." He reached, fingers shaking. The pen he'd dropped lay somewhere under the table, lost. The notary slid a new one toward him. He swallowed. He looked up. At me, then beyond me, at the glass and the mountains and the weather that was building there. Violet and electric at the edge. The sorority girl's phone lit up with a message. She tilted it. Her eyes widened. Whatever she saw wasn't a rope. It was a hole. I held Daniel's gaze the way you hold a door until a wind takes it. I nodded once to the AV tech. The screen shifted to a paused video still of the donor wall. Guests flowed past. 2 figures broke off toward the hallway. It wasn't the worst of it. It was simply the beginning. What came next would be the kind of thing that strips a man of the story he tells about himself. "Brooke," he said. A last bid, a last father-to-wife intonation like he could still make me gentler. I leaned in so only he could hear me. "You taught me to protect the brand." Then, aloud, for the room. "Roll clip 4. The tech's finger hovered over the space bar. The entire table seemed to lean forward, an organism with a single breath, waiting to see the moment the trap finished closing. And just before the sound hit the speakers, the boardroom doors opened. Before the storm, there was always the illusion of clear skies. That's how Daniel liked it. He built our lives around appearances. The right address, the right car in the driveway, the right photographs on glossy pages that showed us smiling with other people who smiled the same way. To anyone watching, we were perfection incarnate. We lived in a Spanish Revival estate on the foothills overlooking Tucson, terracotta roof glowing like fire in the desert sunsets. Inside, the ceilings were vaulted, beams imported, the kind of architecture that makes guests look up and whisper. My mornings were filled with routines that looked charmed from the outside: green juice in stemless glasses, yoga in the sunroom where light spilled through glass panes like liquid gold, a housekeeper humming as she polished away the fingerprints of living. But what outsiders couldn't see was the rhythm underneath it. The metronome of Daniel's ambition clicking through every room. The silence of a house designed not for comfort, but for display. Still, I played my part. I was the wife people admired. The woman who floated into luncheons at La Encantada with her hair perfectly blown out, who sent handwritten notes to donors after charity galas, who posed beside Daniel in photographs that would later hang in offices as inspiration. For years, I believed it myself, that this was happiness, stability, even love. Daniel was magnetic, always had been. When we first met, I thought his confidence was armor for us both. He was the man who shook hands like promises, who ordered at restaurants without looking at the menu, who seemed to bend the world around him until it matched his vision. When he laughed, people laughed harder. When he spoke, they leaned in. And I, in my 20s, thought, this is security, this is power, this is the man who will never let me fall. In quieter moments, he could be tender. He would press a hand to the small of my back as we crossed a room, murmur in my ear that I was his anchor, his steady one, the reason he could climb so high without fear of falling. And I clung to that. I clung to the idea that we were building something together, not just for us, but for the family legacy he carried like a crown. We didn't have children, something he said was for the best. Too distracting, too messy, too risky for the brand he was building. At the time, I nodded, convincing myself it was our choice, our unity. But late at night, when I lay awake listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the desert insects outside, I sometimes wondered if it was ever really a choice at all. Still, I filled my days with purpose. I sat on boards, volunteered at the children's hospital, managed the design of our homes with obsessive care. I told myself this was partnership. That every smile at a fundraiser, every careful nod in a meeting, every, yes, of course, Daniel, was part of the empire we were building together. But even in those days, before the sorority girl, before the humiliations, there were cracks. Small hairline fractures in the porcelain mask. Daniel could never resist being admired. That was his weakness. The thing he tried to disguise as charm, but that I learned to recognize as hunger. The way his eyes lingered just a little too long on waitresses, interns, anyone young and bright enough to reflect back his power. The way he'd tell the same joke twice if the first laugh wasn't loud enough. I remember one night at a gala downtown. The lights were low, candles flickering against mirrored centerpieces, a jazz quartet bleeding through the chatter of wealth. I had worn a gown the color of desert roses, hand-beaded, clinging just enough to remind him I was still the woman he had once chased. Daniel introduced me to a circle of donors, his hand at my back, his voice rich and confident. And then, as I laughed at a story, I saw it. The way his gaze flicked over my shoulder, not at me, but at a young intern balancing trays of champagne. His smile shifted, sharper, hungrier. It was a flicker, nothing more. A single frame in the reel of our lives. But it caught me. For the first time, I felt a chill where I should have felt pride. Later in the car, I teased him gently. "You should be careful with your eyes," I said, my voice light. "People notice." He chuckled, dismissing me with that charming wave of his hand. "You're imagining things, Brooke. You always overanalyze." And maybe I wanted to believe him. So I let it go, telling myself it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was the seed. Our marriage ran on rituals. Friday night dinners at the country club, where Daniel always ordered the filet and sent it back twice just to remind the chef who he was. Sundays at the estate, where he liked to stand by the pool with a drink in hand and hold court with friends who laughed too loud at his stories. I played hostess, pouring wine, brushing my hand along his arm, presenting us as one seamless entity. Yet the more polished the image, the more I noticed the shadows. How he needed admiration the way most men need air. How a compliment could light him up more than love ever did. How, when the room was full, he barely looked at me. But when the room was empty, he pulled me close, whispered that I was the only one who truly understood him. I told myself it was balance. That public distance was offset by private intimacy. But deep down, I think I knew. I think I felt the hollow place growing between us. The first unmistakable red flag came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was in the sunroom, watering the orchids I'd been nurturing for months, their delicate blooms arching like fragile crowns. Daniel walked in, phone in hand, half distracted. "You're wearing that?" he asked, glancing at the linen dress I had thrown on. I frowned. "It's just the garden club luncheon." He smirked, scrolling his phone. "You should try harder. You don't want people thinking I'm trading up." It was a joke. At least, that's how he framed it when I stared at him. A cruel, careless little joke. He kissed my cheek, muttered something about meetings, and left before I could respond. But that sentence stayed with me, like a shard of glass under the skin, impossible to ignore once it's lodged there. Trading up. The words echoed in the quiet house after he left, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings and polished floors. And though I told myself it was just Daniel being Daniel, part of me knew. That was the moment the mask slipped. That was the moment the storm began to gather. The first time I felt the world tilt under me was not when Daniel teased me about trading up. No, that was just the whisper of thunder. The real storm broke one night in late spring, when the desert air still carried the coolness of winter, but the skies over Tucson had begun to smell of dust and electricity. I remember it clearly because it was so ordinary. I had just returned from a board meeting at the children's hospital. I was tired but satisfied, my hands still faintly smelling of lilies from the centerpiece I'd absent-mindedly touched as we left the room. Daniel was supposed to be at a zoning conference in Phoenix. I planned to soak in a bath, sip a glass of Chardonnay, and scroll through the gala seating chart I was finalizing for an upcoming fundraiser. But the house was never silent when Daniel was gone. His absence was loud, echoing through rooms designed to hold a man like him. That night, though, something unusual happened. I walked past his office, and his computer screen was glowing. Daniel was meticulous, obsessive about details, especially appearances. He never left screens open, never left a trace. He logged out of emails, closed tabs, cleared searches. Yet here it was. A pulsing blue light in the dark, a laptop still awake. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was instinct, that primal knowing women carry, the sense that something is just slightly off. I stepped inside, my heels muffled by the thick Persian rug, and looked. His email was open. Not the business account, the one his assistant curated like a museum exhibit. His personal one. The inbox was a chaos of promotions, bank alerts, and unread messages. But near the top, one name appeared again and again, Kelsey. The subject lines were harmless enough at first glance. "Dinner tonight?" Loved last weekend? Miss you already. But then I clicked. The first email opened like a knife to the ribs. Daniel, I can still taste the champagne from your lips. I can't believe they didn't notice us in the hallway. You promised me Paris in the fall. I've already started practicing French. Tell Brooke you're traveling for work again. I'll be waiting. My hand froze on the trackpad. I felt my chest cave in, like the air had been sucked out of me. I scrolled. More messages, photographs, her on his arm at a gala, cropped carefully so I wasn't visible in the frame. Receipts, dinners on the corporate card, a rental on 4th Avenue, weekends that were supposed to be strategy retreats. The sorority girl wasn't a secret fling. She was a second life. And worse, Daniel hadn't stumbled into this. He wasn't a man caught by sudden passion. No. He had been careful, calculated, methodical. He used aliases on hotel bookings, alternate accounts for wire transfers. He had built her a life inside ours, a shadow world running parallel to mine. Shock burned through me first. A numb, icy kind of shock, the kind that makes sound distant and hands tremble. I told myself I must be mistaken, that maybe this was some cruel scam, some phishing scheme using his name. But then the images burned away doubt. Daniel at our charity's annual gala, his lips grazing her ear in a hallway I knew by heart. Daniel wiring thousands to an account with her name, notes littered with hearts and Greek letters. Daniel booking flights to Cabo on weekends he'd told me he was meeting with investors. Grief came next, hot and sudden. My throat tightened until I thought I might choke. My chest ached like I'd been hit. I staggered back from the desk and sank into his leather chair, staring at the glowing evidence of a life I didn't know I was sharing. I thought of the mornings we'd spent drinking coffee by the pool, him teasing me about overwatering the orchids, the nights we'd returned from galas, him sliding his hand across my back as photographers flashed. Every memory I replayed was suddenly poisoned. I couldn't separate the truth from the lie. But the worst came when rage followed. It didn't come like fire. It came like a blade. Cold, sharp, slicing through the fog of shock and grief. Because as I scrolled further, I saw the details that told me this wasn't just betrayal. It was strategy. In one email, he told her not to worry about money, that he'd work Brooke out of the equation soon. In another, he bragged that I was too busy playing charity queen to notice. And in one, the one that sealed my fury into something permanent, he wrote, "The prenup makes me untouchable. Brooke will never leave. She has too much to lose. He used my loyalty, my silence, my devotion. He built his empire on my complicity, and then he mocked me for it." I sat in that chair for hours, staring at the screen, my mind swinging between disbelief and fury. When the sun rose, its light spilling across the desert outside, I was no longer the same woman who had walked into that office the night before. Something inside me had hardened, crystallized. For the next week, I moved like a ghost through our routines. Daniel returned from Phoenix, smiling, tired, dropping his suitcase in the foyer like always. He kissed my cheek, poured himself a scotch, asked about the gala planning. And I played my part. I smiled. I answered. I tucked the knowledge deep inside where it couldn't be seen. But every glance, every laugh, every touch now carried double meaning. When he placed his hand on the small of my back, I imagined those same fingers brushing her skin. When he bragged at the country club about closing a deal, I wondered if he'd whispered the same words to her afterward. One night, at a dinner with friends, I caught him texting under the table. He looked up, eyes catching mine, and smiled so smoothly you'd think nothing was amiss. But I knew. I knew exactly who he was texting. And in that moment, the rage that had crystallized in me sharpened into something else. Intent. The turning point came a few days later, when I drove into town for errands and passed a cafe on University Boulevard. Through the glass, I saw them. Daniel and Kelsey, heads bent together over coffee, his hand brushing hers on the table. She was laughing, wide and open, the way I once laughed when I thought I was the only one. He didn't even flinch when I parked across the street, didn't look up, didn't sense me watching. Because in his mind, I was blind. I was obedient. I was the woman too comfortable to question. I sat in the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened. My pulse roared in my ears. I could have marched in, made a scene, shattered the illusion right there in public, but I didn't. Because in that moment, I realized something Daniel never expected me to. I held the real power. He had built his life on the assumption that I would never act, that I was trapped by the prenup, the appearances, the empire we'd woven together. He thought I was his shield, his silence, his permanence. But I knew the truth now. The clause he thought protected him was the weapon that would destroy him. And as I watched him brush her hair back, lean in with that same practiced smile he once used on me, the thought settled into me like steel. If he wanted to play a game, I would finish it. That was the night I stopped being his wife. That was the night I became his executioner. There's a moment in every betrayal when sorrow burns itself out and leaves something colder behind. For me, it came the night Daniel returned from Phoenix, suitcase in hand, smelling faintly of citrus and her perfume. He dropped the bag by the stairs, loosened his tie, and kissed me like nothing in the world had shifted. Like I hadn't spent the last week staring at his emails, his receipts, his entire double life cataloged in my mind like a museum of cruelty. "Miss me?" he asked, his grin confident, practiced, the same grin that had charmed investors and mistresses alike. I smiled back. Of course. That was the moment. That was when I realized Daniel didn't just cheat. He depended on me not to fight back. He assumed my silence was permanent, that loyalty had calcified into weakness. And once I saw that, once I understood how utterly he underestimated me, something inside me snapped into place like a lock clicking shut. I wasn't going to cry in silence. I wasn't going to be another discarded wife whispered about at country clubs, pitied at luncheons. No, if Daniel believed I was too bound by appearances, by his name, by the prenup, then I would use all of those things to bury him. He had written the script. He had drafted the contract. All I needed to do was follow his rules more faithfully than he ever imagined. Over the next days, I studied him the way a predator studies prey. He came home later than usual, distracted, his phone buzzing with messages he shielded from me with a casual turn of his wrist. He still kissed my cheek, still draped an arm around me in public, still called me darling at dinners. To anyone else, he looked like a man in control of his life. But I knew better. I could see the seams, the sweat at his temple when his phone lit up during a board meeting, the way his eyes flickered, guilty when I mentioned Paris in passing, the very trip he had promised to her. And all the while, he never noticed me watching, never noticed how quiet I had become. That was his greatest mistake. Daniel lived his life like a man performing for a crowd, always assuming applause. He never considered that the woman standing silently beside him might be memorizing every line of the play. One evening, at the country club, it happened again. A waitress bent slightly to pour his wine, and his gaze lingered just a fraction too long. I caught it, filed it away, but said nothing. Later, as we left, he leaned in and whispered, "Don't give me that look, Brooke. You're too classy for jealousy." Jealousy. He thought that's what this was. He thought the storm inside me was nothing more than insecurity. I let him believe it. Because revenge isn't born in screams or slammed doors. It's born in silence. It grows in observation, in patience, in the certainty that when the moment comes, you won't miss. The turning point crystallized one afternoon in the garden. I was tending my orchids, misting them carefully, when Daniel walked in on a phone call. His voice was low, but I caught enough. "Don't worry, she'll never know. Brooke doesn't pay attention to details." I froze, spray bottle in hand, water droplets clinging to the air between us. "Doesn't pay attention?" I nearly laughed. I had been paying attention for weeks. For years, really. Every glance, every slip, Every cruel little comment he thought disappeared into the air. I carried them all, and now I would use them. He ended the call, kissed the top of my head as if I were a child, and walked away without another thought. That was it. The final confirmation. Daniel wasn't just betraying me, he was erasing me, reducing me to a shadow in my own home, a convenient prop in his narrative. But I wasn't a shadow. I was the storm on the horizon he didn't see coming. That night, lying beside him in the cavernous silence of our bedroom, I stared at the ceiling beams and made my decision. I would not leave quietly. I would not give him the dignity of a divorce where he paid me off and continued his life with his sorority toy. No, if he wanted to gamble that I wouldn't act, I would make the consequences unbearable. I whispered it to myself in the dark, a promise carved in stone. You will lose everything, Daniel. Not just me. Everything. From that moment, I moved differently. At brunches, I smiled wider, laughed louder, made him believe I was still the dutiful wife. I even complimented his choice of tie, knowing the girl had probably bought it for him. He never questioned my sudden lightness. He thought I had accepted things the way women always did in his stories of failed marriages. But beneath the surface, the planning had already begun. I retrieved the prenup from our safe, laying the pages out on my desk, studying every clause as if it were scripture. I ran my fingers along the lines, committing them to memory, savoring the language he had once mocked me for not understanding. The very contract he had used to cage me would become the blade I'd press to his throat. And as I tucked the papers back into their envelope, smoothing the creases, I felt something new, calm, cold, absolute calm, the kind that doesn't waver, doesn't break, doesn't forgive. Daniel thought I was fragile. He thought I was bound to him, too loyal, too dependent, too blind. What he didn't realize was that his arrogance had given me every tool I needed. And as I watched him sleep that night, his chest rising and falling in the dim light, I felt the first spark of satisfaction. Because for the first time since discovering the betrayal, I wasn't just surviving it. I was already planning his downfall. Revenge is not an impulse. It is a discipline. Once I decided Daniel would pay, I became something new, meticulous, deliberate, a woman with a ledger no one else could see. The first step was knowledge. I pulled the prenup from the safe again, spreading the pages across my desk in the sunroom while the desert light burned through the glass. Every clause, every amendment, every arrogant flourish Daniel's lawyer had added 20 years ago became my scripture. Clause 14, the one designed to protect the family brand, was my weapon, but weapons must be sharpened. I highlighted triggers, marked timelines, and called in a favor from an attorney friend Daniel had never bothered to remember. I didn't tell her everything, just enough to get clarity. She walked me through the enforcement language, confirming what I already knew. Proof of infidelity tied to public representation meant automatic forfeiture of assets, voting shares, and control. The clause was airtight. Daniel had written it himself to make me feel replaceable. He never imagined it would become the rope around his neck. The second step was evidence. Proof mattered. Proof wasn't whispers, it was receipts, photographs, recordings. Luckily, Daniel had become careless. His corporate card statements were a breadcrumb trail, meals charged in towns he wasn't supposed to be in, boutique purchases in sizes that were never mine. I ordered copies of every monthly statement for the last 2 years, neatly filed them in binders. Then came surveillance. I hired a private investigator, discreet, expensive, the kind who doesn't flinch when the subject is powerful. Within a week, I had photos. Daniel with Kelsey at restaurants, slipping into her apartment, his hand at the small of her back in the exact gesture he once reserved for me. The images weren't grainy, they were sharp, undeniable. One evening, I followed them myself. They were at a wine bar downtown, the kind with dim lights and velvet booths. I sat 2 tables away, hidden by shadows, and listened. Her laugh was shrill, his voice low, full of promises. He leaned close, whispering, and my stomach churned. But I didn't look away. I recorded everything on my phone, the screen dark in my hand. Proof, layered upon proof. The closer I got, the more dangerous it became. One night, while scanning through his desk drawers, Daniel walked in unexpectedly. I closed the drawer, lifted my glass of wine, and pretended to be reading a magazine. He smiled, kissed my forehead, and went upstairs without a thought. My pulse pounded so loud I thought he might hear it. But that was his arrogance. He never believed I was capable of deceit. That blindness became my shield. Still, I couldn't afford to be sloppy. I practiced lying, practiced smiling when I wanted to spit venom. At dinners, when he brushed my hand in front of others, I squeezed back, eyes warm. When he made cruel little jokes, I laughed lightly, never letting my gaze betray me. He believed it all. The third step was setting the stage. Clause 14 required public evidence of betrayal connected to the family brand. I already had private photos, recordings, statements, but I needed the scene, the undeniable exposure. That's when the gala became my battlefield. The Sonoran Children's Foundation annual fundraiser. Donors, board members, media, all under one roof. Daniel never missed it. He loved the spotlight, loved being the benevolent benefactor. And he always brought me. But last year he brought her too. He thought no one noticed, thought slipping into hallways and whispering in corners was invisible. He was wrong. Cameras are everywhere, eyes are everywhere, and I had arranged for a few more to be exactly where I needed them. With the PI's help, I secured footage from security cameras, cut together a reel that told the story without ambiguity. Daniel with Kelsey, hand on her waist, lips brushing her ear. Daniel's corporate card covering the suite at the hotel across the street. Time-stamped, cross-referenced, undeniable. The fourth step was control. I needed allies, people who would stand firm when the floor collapsed. I began quietly cultivating the board members I trusted most, reminding them of my steady hand in past crises, hinting at Daniel's volatility. I didn't tell them everything, not yet. Just enough to plant doubt, to shift their loyalty by inches. By the time the truth emerged, they would already be leaning my way. One afternoon, over coffee, one of the executives confessed something Daniel had said at a private dinner. He called you replaceable, he admitted, eyes apologetic. Said you'd never leave. We laughed because we thought he was joking. Replaceable. That word again. I smiled tightly, sipped my coffee, and said nothing. But inside, my fury hardened into diamond. Every move carried risk. There were nights I lay awake, terrified he would discover the files I'd hidden in a lockbox at the bottom of my closet. There were moments I thought I saw suspicion flicker in his eyes. Once, he asked me casually if I'd been in his office, because a drawer felt out of place. My blood turned to ice. I smiled, feigned confusion, and kissed him to distract him. He believed me. Each close call sharpened me further. I learned to mask fear with calm, to channel rage into patience. I became the perfect wife on the surface, so polished that no one could imagine the storm brewing beneath. And slowly, meticulously, the plan assembled itself. Proof of his infidelity. Legal clarity on the prenup. Strategic allies ready to side with me. And the stage, the boardroom, where his empire was most vulnerable, where Clause 14 would echo the loudest. I even invited her, Kelsey. She thought it was because I had finally accepted things, that I wanted to welcome her into Daniel's world. She came giggling, naive, flattered. She had no idea she was walking into the execution chamber. The final piece clicked into place one evening as I watched Daniel across the dinner table. He was boasting about a land acquisition, gesturing with his fork, eyes gleaming with the thrill of conquest. And all I could think was, he doesn't know he's already lost. That was the moment I knew. The plan was ready. The evidence was airtight. The allies were in place. The stage was set. All that remained was to strike. The morning of the board meeting, the desert sky stretched cloudless, a sheet of merciless blue. I stood at my vanity, fastening pearl earrings Daniel had once given me after closing a deal. They had been meant as tokens of triumph, little symbols of his power. Today, they were armor. I dressed deliberately, a black sheath dress, tailored perfectly, understated yet commanding. I painted my lips crimson, the exact shade that never failed to unnerve him. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I no longer saw the silent wife he thought I was. I saw the architect of his ruin. Daniel kissed me before we left the house, as if it were any other day. He smelled of cedar cologne and arrogance. "You'll be there for me today, won't you?" he said, eyes gleaming. I smiled. Always. The boardroom hummed with anticipation. Executives in pressed suits, attorneys with thick binders, assistants scribbling notes. At the head of the table, Daniel presided like a king in his castle, confident, expansive. His mistress sat near the back, legs crossed, trying too hard to look casual. She thought she was entering the kingdom. She didn't know she was entering the gallows. I waited until the meeting began, until Daniel launched into his presentation on quarterly earnings, his voice full of that practiced charm. Then, quietly, I slid the envelope across the table to legal counsel. "Add this to the record," I said. Daniel's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then returned. "Brooke, what's this?" "Proof," I said, my voice calm, carrying across the room. The projector screen flickered, and the first image appeared. Daniel in a hallway at the Sonoran Gala, lips grazing Kelsey's ear. The room shifted instantly, a collective inhale. He straightened, chuckling nervously. This is ridiculous. Out of context." The next image hit before he could finish. A hotel receipt, his name, his card, the same night. Then a bank transfer to her account, emojis in the notes. Then surveillance footage, him slipping into her apartment. Then the emails, projected in stark black and white, his words promising her Paris, mocking me as too busy playing charity queen. The boardroom was silent, except for the faint buzz of the projector. Daniel's face drained of color. His mistress shifted in her chair, her confidence evaporating. "You can't," Daniel began, his voice cracking. I leaned forward, my voice silk over steel. Clause 14. Gasps rippled down the table. Everyone knew what that meant. Daniel had boasted about the prenup for years, prided himself on the clause that protected the family brand. And now, his own words were the sword severing his empire from his hands. The attorney cleared his throat, voice clinical. "Per the agreement, this constitutes a breach of representation. Assets, voting shares, and controlling interest transfer automatically to the uninvolved spouse." Daniel slammed his palm on the table. No, this is a setup." "Your setup," I said coldly. "You wrote it, you signed it, you triggered it." His gaze darted around the table, searching for loyalty, but he found only averted eyes. His executives, his allies, the men and women who had once hung on his every word, sat in silence. The brand had to be protected. And now, I was the brand. The sorority girl finally stood, trembling. "You said," she began, her voice small. "Sit down," he snapped, the fury of a man losing everything lashing out at the one person still close enough to hit. The room flinched, the girl's face crumpled, tears welling, and for the first time the sympathy in the room shifted. Not toward Daniel, but toward his collateral damage. His cruelty was exposed, raw, undeniable. I rose from my chair, each movement deliberate, the room watching as though choreographed. "This is no longer Daniel Nomelson's boardroom," I said. "Effective immediately, I assume control as per the agreement. Legal filings have already been submitted." Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, a king stripped of his crown. And then the final blow landed. The doors opened, and a journalist stepped in, escorted by PR. Cameras followed. This wasn't just a board meeting anymore. It was a spectacle. Daniel's affair, his humiliation, his downfall would not be whispered behind closed doors. It would be headlines. Daniel lunged toward me, desperation in his eyes. "Brooke, you can't do this. You'll ruin me. You'll ruin us." I held his gaze, unflinching. "There is no us. He froze, the words hitting harder than any evidence. His empire, his image, his mistress, gone. His marriage, gone. His legacy, stripped by his own arrogance. The journalist's camera clicked. Flash. Another. The room lit with his ruin, each photograph a nail in the coffin of his reputation. The sorority girl fled the room sobbing. The board members whispered, already adjusting to the new order. Daniel sagged against the table, his hands trembling, the mighty mogul of Tucson reduced to nothing in a single afternoon. I walked past him, my heels sharp against the polished floor. As I reached the door, I paused, turning back to deliver the final cut. "You always said the brand had to survive any individual's collapse," I said softly. "Congratulations, Daniel. You were right." And then I left him there, crumbling under the weight of his own downfall, cameras capturing every second, no way back, no dignity left to salvage. The headlines bloomed before the ink on the filings had even dried. Real estate tycoon exposed in affair scandal clause back empire, Nomelson ousted by wife gala footage. Leaks, donor funds tied to affair. Every paper, every channel, every glossy magazine that once fawned over Daniel now circled like vultures. The photos from the boardroom, his pallid face, my calm stare, the mistress fleeing in tears, were everywhere. What had been his strength, his obsession with appearances, became the very weapon that destroyed him. Within a week, sponsors pulled out of his projects. The mayor's office quietly rescinded an award he was due to receive. His phone, once buzzing with invitations and praise, fell silent. Allies distanced themselves. Friends vanished. Even his golf partners found reasons not to return calls. And the girl? She disappeared into the shadows, her social media accounts deleted overnight, her name whispered only in hushed tones. Daniel had promised her Paris. Instead, he left her with humiliation and headlines she could never escape. At home, the silence was different now, no longer oppressive, no longer hollow. It was mine. My orchids bloomed in the sunroom, their petals arching proudly. The staff, who had once looked at me with pity, now nodded with quiet respect. I was no longer the shadow in Daniel's empire. I was the empire. Daniel, meanwhile, unraveled. I saw glimpses of it in the papers, photos of him leaving a hotel in wrinkled clothes, unshaven, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. He fought in court, of course, but every motion was denied. The prenup was ironclad. He had written it that way. And the evidence was so overwhelming no judge dared to side with him. One by one, the pillars of his life crumbled. His office was emptied. His accounts were frozen. Properties slipped through his fingers. The man who once signed deals worth millions was reduced to borrowing from friends, the few still foolish enough to answer his calls. I never saw him beg directly, but I heard about it. He showed up at the home of an old business partner, drunk, demanding a loan. He cornered one of the board members at a restaurant, shouting about betrayal until security dragged him out. Every story was another reminder that the mighty Daniel Nomelson was gone, replaced by a desperate man clawing at the ruins of his own making. I should have felt pity, but I didn't. Because for 20 years I had given him everything: loyalty, silence, devotion. And he had repaid me with arrogance, cruelty, betrayal. The destruction wasn't my doing. It was his. I simply handed him the mirror and let him watch himself collapse. Weeks passed, then months. I took his seat at the boardroom table, my signature now the one that carried weight. Investors, once wary, grew comfortable under my steady leadership. The brand not only survived, it thrived. One evening, I stood on the balcony of the estate, the desert stretching out in endless twilight. The air was warm, the sky painted in purples and reds. I thought of all the nights I had stood there before, waiting for Daniel to return, imagining he was building something for us both. Now I knew better. He had built it for himself, and in the end, it became mine. But the story wasn't finished. Not yet. The final twist came on a Tuesday morning, unassuming, quiet. My attorney delivered the news with a neutral expression, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of satisfaction. Daniel petitioned for bankruptcy, she said. I nodded. It was expected. He had nothing left. She hesitated, then slid another document across the desk. But there's something else. He moved assets, illegally, offshore transfers, shell accounts. It's all documented. He thought no one would find it, but she smiled faintly. We did. For a moment, I let the weight of it settle. Daniel hadn't just betrayed me. He had betrayed the law. The authorities moved quickly. Investigations opened, subpoenas issued, and within weeks, Daniel Nomelson, once Tucson's golden mogul, was indicted on charges of fraud, tax evasion, and concealment of assets. I attended the hearing quietly, seated in the back. He shuffled in, thinner now, his suit ill-fitting, his once proud shoulders slumped. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted. He avoided my gaze, but I didn't avoid his. When the judge read the charges, his jaw trembled. The room buzzed with the enormity of it. Not just a man losing his fortune, but a man losing his freedom. The final blow had landed. Months later, when the verdict came, it was swift, guilty, sentenced to years in federal prison. His name, once engraved on donor walls and country club plaques, became synonymous with disgrace. His empire was gone. His freedom was gone. His mistress was gone. And the wife he had mocked as powerless was the one who had orchestrated it all. I visited him once at his request. The prison meeting room was sterile, the glass between us smudged. He looked older, gray at the edges, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the phone. Why? He asked, his voice broken. Why couldn't you just leave? I leaned in, my eyes cold. Because leaving would have been mercy. He flinched, as if the words themselves struck him. I hung up the phone, rose, and walked away. Behind me, he banged his fist against the glass, a hollow sound that echoed in the empty room. And that was it. The final image of Daniel Nomelson. Not a mogul, not a king, but a broken man in a jumpsuit, screaming at the ghost of a woman he thought he owned. As I stepped out into the sunlight, the desert stretched before me, vast and eternal. For the first time in decades, I felt free, but freedom wasn't the prize. The prize was knowing that Daniel's downfall wasn't just scandal or ruin. It was permanent, irreversible, absolute. And as the sun blazed overhead, I whispered to myself the truth he never saw coming. The prenup didn't just protect the brand, it buried him with it. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. I'd love to know what you think. Have you ever witnessed a betrayal this deep, or felt the sting of someone underestimating you? Share your thoughts and experiences down in the comments. I read every one. And if this story kept you hooked, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next tale of betrayal, revenge, and justice served cold.